In this lesson, we'll start that process of dissecting everything about this application that we created based on scaffolding in Visual Studio for ASP.NET MVC off of the entity data model that we created. Okay, so I want to focus for a moment on the URLs that are being employed because we kind of glossed over that in the previous video. Let's take a look specifically at this bar product. I can click the edit hyperlink for the bar and notice that not only does it take me to the edit screen where I can change the name and the price, but more importantly for our conversation in this lesson, notice the URL /products/edit/ and here's a series of numbers and letters, and obviously that is the GUID. If we take a look, let's D9B, if you take a look at our products table in our Acme database, D9B blah 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 is the bar. Okay, very nice. And so now look what I can do. I can edit this URL. I can hack this URL and just grab the details for the bar, or I could even get to the delete screen for the bar just by modifying the URL, not clicking on any hyperlinks. I was able to hack the URL because it follows a specific pattern. Furthermore, if I wanted to get to something other than the bar, let's get to the foo, and let's replace the GUID, and you know what's going to happen. It's going to work with the foo entity in the context of deleting that product potentially from our database. All right, and so these types of URLs that you see here, these patterned URLs, are known as RESTful URLs. REST, capital R, capital E, capital S, capital T. It stands for representational state transfer. And basically the URL represents the desired state of an entity through that URL pattern. So in this case, I desire the state of that URL to be deleted or to be updated or to just be viewable. Okay, so this was one of the design goals of the developers of ASP.NET MVC way back in 2007. REST allows you to create these clean, predictable, actionable URLs for your application. Again, hackable URLs. And this idea was gaining steam about the time when MVC framework was being developed, and it's not unique any longer to MVC. Web Forms is able to handle this too, I believe. I've never tried it though, honestly. So that's one thing that I wanted to point out here, are the RESTful nature of the URLs that are being employed in our MVC applications. Furthermore, you know, have you given some thought to how is it that that URL winds up getting handled in our application by the products controller, by the delete, here we go, the delete action result method, and then how did it know specifically that that GUID should be used as the input parameter to this delete method so that we could find it in the database, pull it out, present it to the user and say, are you sure you want to delete that one? Okay. Yeah, I know that it works. My question is, how is it that it works? What's going on inside of ASP.NET MVC that routes an incoming request and it finds the correct action result method in the correct controller to handle that request? All right. And then I want to reiterate the hypothetical question. I guess it wasn't all that hypothetical. From one of the previous lessons, and let's just go into the index view of the product, and we see here in line number 10 that we're calling that HTML helper class, specifically the action link helper method, to create a new hyperlink. And if we run the application quickly, you can see that we simply are creating a anchor tag with the text create new, and when you click it, it takes you to the /product/create URL. And my question is, how is it that this action link method new to send somebody or to create a URL for the proper /product/create. Why didn't it create a URL for just /create or /home/create? Okay, and so the answer to both of these questions has to do with ASP.NET MVC routing, or just ASP.NET routing for that matter, because again, this is one of those subsystems that's common across all ASP.NET technologies. But the ASP.NET MVC framework was the first to include a flexible URL routing system that enables you to define the URL mapping rules within your applications. And that routing system has two main purposes. First of all, to map incoming requests. So based on the URL that's being requested, and as it comes into the application, then the routing system will route that request to the correct controller and the correct action result method that will then handle that request and deliver the correct view back to the user. So that's the first main purpose. The second main purpose is that it will construct outgoing URLs that can be used to call back into the controller and actions. And so having the ability to use URL mapping rules to handle both incoming requests and to construct outgoing URLs for things like anchor tags adds a lot of flexibility to the application code. You recall what I said about the action link method before. If we were to change the structure of our application somehow, we would only need to make that change in one place, and every other view or controller that follows the rules and uses things like this action link method, as long as it is using that and not hard coding stuff, then it won't impact the application. You'll be able to make sweeping changes very quickly. And the canonical example is that our marketing department for our company, after we built the application, they want to change the URL structure for our application. So in this case, we have acme.com/product/details/whatever, and suppose that they want to change the /products to /catalog. Well, does that mean I got to go in, I got to change what it's called in the database, so I need to change what it's called in my controller? No, I don't. I just need to make one small change, and we'll show you where to make that change, and then it will make sweeping changes, and I won't have to make any other. It literally will be just one change of a literal string in a code file, and we have completely changed the structure of our application. And so maybe they want to make these sweeping changes for things like search engine optimization. But again, very simple to make those sweeping changes. Okay, so let's start that process of figuring all this out. If you take a look in the app start folder, there's this file called routeconfig.cs, and it has this method called register routes. And the register routes method is being called on the application start event handler in the global.asax file.cs. And you can see here we're calling routeconfig.register routes. So we're saying, hey, at the very beginning of the application, when it first starts up, I need you to go out and to figure out all of the route mappings that have been defined, because all incoming requests are going to have to look at a table of route patterns to decide where to route that incoming request to. Okay, so back in the routeconfig.cs, we have this route defined here between lines 16 and 20. It's all one line of code. It's just been broken up for readability's sake. And another thing that helps with readability and would help us to, if we're not in the business of creating routes every single day of our career, these name parameters are very helpful. So you can see that we're creating a collection of routes, so that's being passed in, and we're populating that route collection with new routes that we're creating. So in this case, we're calling this map route. It's going to create a new route called default. Now, we only have one route in this case, and it's probably going to be sufficient for simple applications. But let's take a look at all these parameters here so that we better understand what's going on. Why do we even need to give a route a name? Well, there might be certain situations where we need to say, hey, of all the options, you may have 10 or 20 routes that have been defined. To create an outgoing route, we may say use the default route specifically to construct the shape or the pattern for the outgoing href property of the anchor tag. Okay, so names do come in handy in that scenario. Secondly, you can see the URL input parameter defines the pattern that will be matched up, and the pattern is defined by a series of segments in the URL, and a segment is defined by that / in the URL. So this is the first segment, and this is the second segment, and this is the third segment right here. And so we can see that whatever the first segment is will be the controller. So it will take that first segment /products, it will add controller on the end, and it will look in that products controller class for what comes next, which is the action result method. So that's the next little segment of the URL. And in this case, so if we go /products /details, it's going to look for the detail action method inside of the product controller. Furthermore, you can see that if there's another segment on the end of it, then that should represent the ID, an identifier for a specific entity or a specific item, and we're going to pass that in as an argument to the details action result method on the products controller. Okay, but the final input parameter to the map route is probably one of the more important, one of the more interesting. You can see here that we create a new default, and we set if a controller is not specified, if we leave that off, then assume that we're working with the home controller. So yeah, I lied a little bit before. I said that by convention that ASP.NET MVC will look for the home controller and the index action method. That wasn't exactly true. That was actually configured. I just didn't want to talk about it at the time. But I guess it is a convention in so much that it's defined here by default for you from the templates, from the project template for an ASP.NET MVC application. Now, we already noticed previously that when we attempted to go to the root of our application, so we go here to just localhost :port number /, it's looking for the home controller, and the home controller doesn't exist in our project. What if we just changed this from home and made the products controller? What if we made that the default, so that we didn't have to specify that segment, and yet it would still go to the products controller and the index action method, resulting in our arrival here at the index view. So this is the equivalent of going /products /index. And because we've defined defaults, we could either leave just the action segment off, or we could leave the action segment and we could leave off the controller segment, and we'd still get to the same place because those were defined as the defaults. If they weren't supplied, use that. Now, the ID is a different matter altogether. Notice that it's adorned with a URL parameter.optional property. So we don't have to supply the ID. It's optional. And again, if we were trying to create a list, it wouldn't make sense to create a list and then give it an ID. We want all of the IDs, all of the products for our application. However, there are instances where we have to give it a ID or else it wouldn't work. And the ID will be mapped as a URL parameter. It will be mapped as a parameter that's input into a given action method. So again, if we were to go to the details for bar, we go to /products /details / and then we get this GUID. And if we take a look at the products controller for the details action method, where are you here? Yeah. That GUID is passed as an input parameter automatically by the routing system. Okay? So, very cool. Now, again, later on we're going to create a custom route, but this simple route should suffice for most simple applications. We can revisit this. We can design our own hackable URLs that makes sense for our specific applications. But again, this will suffice for most of this series. Now, it's important to remember, as I often forget, that the map route that's created right here has two purposes. It is to handle incoming requests, yes, that's what we just talked about, but it also is used to create outgoing URLs. So if we take a look in the index.cshtml page in line number 10, here we come back to that HTML helper class dot action link. Now, as I said earlier, there are a bunch of overloaded versions of this, and in some of these we can define the controller name. In some of these, all we need to do is define just the action name. We can pass in some additional information like route values and HTML attributes. We'll talk about those later. However, I think it's important to understand that based on what we pass in, the action link method will take into consideration all the map routes that have been defined, and it'll find the match based on what we're trying to create. In this case, we've only defined the action method, so it's going to assume that whatever controller we're currently working inside of, that it wants to create a action segment for that URL. So we didn't have to give it the products. I think we can just do that, right? There's got to be an overload that just takes that. But at any rate, so this would be a very overt way of saying specifically make sure that it's products. However, this is just assumes that products because we're already inside the context of the products controller. But at any rate, again, the action link method will take into consideration any map routes that have been defined and dynamically create the shape of the URL for that create functionality as a result. So that's an important to understand. We're not just talking about map routes for incoming request routing, but also for outgoing URL creation. All right, I'm going to come back to this file in just a minute, but let me finish up the route config and then we can move on. You might have wondered what this line of code means. You can safely ignore it. In fact, look at the name. Ignore this route. This .axd, it's there to handle incoming requests that web forms, web server controls can make to request items on the web server. So any resources it needs, files like CSS files or JavaScript files, it can request a resource with the .axt file extension, and it'll give it back that resource. And what we're merely saying here is that just ignore that functionality. We're not dealing with web forms. So if anybody's trying to get at a URL that looks anything like that, well, then they're probably trying to hack our website. So let's just ignore that route altogether and just give them a 404. Okay? It's as simple as that. You can just ignore that. Okay, so we finished up route config. Let's get back here in the index.cshtml. We've talked about the action link method here. Let's look at another action link method and you can see that here's the combination of action link methods for edit, details, and delete. And you can see that this looks a little bit different. Not only do we have the action segment defined as edit, details, and delete, but there's also this other portion here, and IntelliSense tells us that those are route values. So these are values that pertain to the route, and here we're saying specifically create an anonymous object, an object without any definition, without a name. Just make sure that that new anonymous object has an ID, and we're going to set that ID equal to the product ID for that given item, whether it's foo, or bar, or baz, or quirk. And this will be the segment at the very end, that optional ID segment. We're going to populate it with the GUID from the database. Okay? And so action link again takes this into consideration, this into consideration, it takes this into consideration, and it constructs a URL so that you can safely get to the specific edit, details, and delete functionality for the given entity. Okay. All right, so to recap, the most important takeaway is that the routing system is a very important component to the ASP.NET MVC framework. It allows for a high degree of flexibility in routing incoming requests to the appropriate controller, to the appropriate action result method, as well as passing along additional information in segments like we talked about right here. But it also makes creating URLs very flexible so that we can modify the entire URL design of our application by modifying just the routes that are defined right here, as we were able to do when we said, hey, don't start off by looking for the home controller, start off looking for the products controller. We're able to change the fundamental functionality and the design of our application just by making one small change in the default route. Okay? Now, in our case, we're relying on that default route to help construct the proper outgoing URLs, to create a new product, to edit the product, to get the details about the product, or delete a specific product. However, we could create additional map routes for whatever we want to accomplish in our application. If you go around and look at Amazon as a good example, they have a lot of segments in their URLs, and they all have a purpose. Well, we could create multifaceted segments for passing additional information throughout our application as a form of state management. Okay, we'll talk about all that later when we get to creating custom routes. All right, so I hope that makes sense. That's a crucial piece of information because routes are central to ASP.NET MVC. See you in the next video. Thanks.